Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. US President Donald Trump's directives on DEI, diversity, equity and inclusion, have caused major shockwaves across the US, with government departments and agencies ordered to change their employment and hiring practices. It's also spread to the private sector, with some companies like Facebook and Instagram owner Meta cancelling DEI programs altogether to align themselves with the Trump administration. And in a further escalation of the policy, the administration wrote to large companies in the EU, ordering them to comply with the ban on DEI programs if they're a supplier or service provider to the American government. It's getting very complicated, dealing with the way people are employed, the opportunities they're given in the workplace, and the need to ensure fair representation of society is not easy. But there are many who feel that reform to DEI is overdue and shouldn't be rejected outright. Maud Lindley is the founding director of Serendis Leadership. Before starting the firm more than 2 decades ago, she held senior roles in global investment banks, including HSBC, Societe Generale, and UBS. Since founding Serendis, she's worked with leaders at ASX 200 companies like Macquarie Group, Westpac and AGL, and international organisations including Citi and JP Morgan. Maud Lindley, welcome to the studio.
Thank you so much, Sean.
First, set the scene for us when we're talking about DEI as it relates to Australian companies. What are we talking about?
Look, fortunately and quite reassuringly, organisations in Australia are still standing firm on their aspirations to bring diversity to their boards, to their executive teams. There's a strong commitment still from Australian organisations to pursue their DEI initiatives. So I'm not concerned in terms of how the business community has responded to the Trump effect. However, I spend hours in workshop facilitation, engaging leaders, supporting leaders to think about how they can bring more inclusion in the way they lead. And during those conversations, I hear a lot of things that are concerning. And I think it's an opportunity today. We're getting to a point of maturity on the topic. It's an opportunity to hear those voices and understand how we can address them.
So what's concerning that you're hearing? I mean, no names, but what are you worried about?
I'm worried about the perception from a part of the population that the way we're tackling DEI is perceived as unfair. So what I'm hearing is, we're tackling unfairness with unfairness. We're trying to address an uneven playing field by leveling the playing field in a different way. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the actions, the positive discrimination that we are using today to help level that playing field is experienced as a threat for many leaders. And, of course, you would think, well, is it male leaders, in particular, white Anglo-Saxon male leaders? Yeah, of course, yes. But many women actually resent this positive discrimination, the actions that come with positive discriminations, because they feel it as undermining their appointment. When they are appointed to significant roles, they worry that people will think it's just because you're a woman. That is incredibly detrimental to their success.
Everything you've said, I keep thinking in the back of my mind, what should be DEI?
Yes.
And maybe what is DEI?
We've got to start from the beginning. We have two different aspirations that are pursued at the same time. And unfortunately, because they're not explained, they're not dissociated, they undermine each other. So you have one aspiration, which is fixing the fact that women are not represented equally at board and executive levels within our organizations, right? I mean, we only have 9 female CEOs out of the ASX 200 companies. Chair representation is probably around the 10% mark, 10 to 12% mark. We're getting there in terms of board representation, 37 to 43%. But you can see that we still have a fairly unequal representation of women. So we need to address this. And there's a lot of underpinning unconscious biases. The patriarchy is still very much experienced by many women. So there are a lot of fundamental inequalities that we can tackle. That's one aspiration. The other aspiration is to bring diversity of thought, to bring an adaptive and inclusive workplace environment where we're capable of harnessing cognitive diversity, a diversity of mental models, so that we make better decisions and we create a more innovative, creative way of tackling today's business biggest challenges. The problem is that we're amalgamating those two things and we're saying, bring more women, we need to fix this, it's unfair, and you'll have diversity of thought. The problem with this is that it's not exactly right. It's not exactly, one is not necessarily fixing the other. There are certainly, there's a huge interplay between the two, but we need to explain better how those two things cohabitate or almost live side by side, but should be tackled differently. And we need to bring a different narrative. We need to enrich the narrative beyond or behind why diversity of thought is important at an organizational level and how to foster that diversity of thought. It is my experience and my belief that this second aspiration and the narrative behind the why diversity of thought is important and how diversity of thought needs to be leveraged, if we enrich this narrative, we will get further on the first issue that is very real, which is gender inequality.
Maud, we might dive into that in a moment. We'll be back. I'm talking to Maud Lindley from Serendis Leadership. Okay, so let's keep going down the path of the diversity of thought and bring it back to what Donald Trump is doing in the US. Is your thesis that by throwing it all up in the air, which he effectively is doing, we get a chance to reset?
No, look, I think what Trump is doing is incredibly detrimental to the cause that we all want to pursue. I think the way that he's tackling it is woeful. And so I really would hate for us to think that the way that he's tackling it, there's anything to learn from this. Yeah. However, why have people voted for him? Why have people sort of elicited that change? It's because they are fearful of the way that we're bringing this topic to life. And, you know, if we are really committed to bringing change, we need all change agents. We need all the people who are actors of this change to actually be on board with what we want to achieve. And if there are people who are not on board, we can get frustrated. I certainly get very frustrated at times when I observe, male leaders not understanding the unequal playing field, not understanding the fact that there are unconscious biases at play. Certainly, we can respond emotionally, but we also need to understand that change is only effective when people have the desire to change, when they understand why it's important to change, when they are equipped as to what they can do, and when there is a positive reinforcement that the change is going to be positive for everyone. I believe we can find that narrative that will engage everyone, and that will take us further and faster.
How, though? How do you do it? I mean, this has been something that we've been talking about for a long time, and it has improved. But did you say 9 CEO leaders, female CEO leaders of the top 200 companies haven't done that good a job?
Perhaps because there are forces at play that we're not seeing, that we're not hearing, that are acting against the change. And these people, whether we agree with them or not, I don't agree with them, but we need to listen to them. We need to bring them to the conversation and we need to engage them. Now, you've asked me, we've tried, why haven't we succeeded? Now, we haven't really explained why and how diversity of thought is helpful. We haven't really explained that there is a fundamental shift in the way that organizations foster their culture that is required before we can really see diversity of thought flourishing. We need to disconnect the concept of identity diversity, which is demographic diversity around the table, and cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity is the extent to which you have a diversity of mental models around the table. If we actively seek out cognitive diversity, we're going to get a broader spectrum of the population. Today, what we're doing is we're trying to achieve gender diversity or cultural diversity, but we're still looking for people who think the same way. We're still looking for people who have ticked the same experience box, the same background, the same university. So if we broaden actually what we're expecting for any role, we will attract a broader spectrum of the population. But that's not enough. That's only just starting. It's only bringing diversity to the table. For diversity to stick, for diversity to flourish, for everyone to be really considered as equal in their pursuit to top leadership positions, we need to transform the way that we make decisions. We need to really explain what inclusion means. Inclusion doesn't mean consensus. Inclusion doesn't mean being nice. When we seek out to be nice and to make decisions based on consensus, we create groupthink. We create in-group. That's actually the enemy of diversity of thought, cognitive diversity, and adaptability. So we need to create an environment where people are hungry to be challenged. That's really hard because in an environment where being right seems the most important thing to achieve, to be recognized, that's actually a really hard thing to do. So we've got to start from the beginning at re-explaining that the role of a leader is to curate debate, to curate constructive dissent, to make decisions by harnessing diversity of thought that are going to challenge oneself.
We are totally out of time, but that's really difficult. When you're talking, it reminds me of like how I manage my children, right? My children come at things in a really different way. Yeah. And cognitive diversity is harder to get your head around than there's a male, there's a female, there's a 50-year-old, there's a 25-year-old. Actually understanding cognitive diversity and reaping the rewards from it is really tough.
We've come to a point of maturity where I think it's needed and it's possible. And we can still measure identity diversity to check whether we are successful. I still think we need to measure identity diversity targets. We need to set targets and measure whether we get there. But when you go to your middle manager, instead of telling them you need to reach those identity diversity targets, you need to explain to them and support them to think about diversity of thought. Yep. We can't measure diversity of thought, but we can start to measure the culture that enables diversity of thought. So if you use a lever, which is adapting your culture, measuring a different type of culture as a lever of change, and then your output is your identity diversity targets, we'll get to those targets much more sustainably than perhaps where we are now.
I hope so. Maud, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thanks so much for having me.
That was Maud Lindley, Founding Director of Serendis Leadership. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.